if you want to share your video, you're more than welcome to, obviously. There we go.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Hannah. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Today, Mark and I will be presenting some of the results of one of our latest projects in Peru, and this was related to the artisanal shrimp trawl fishery and ways to assess bycatch and evaluating potential mitigation alternatives. So just to give you an idea of where we were working, this is the north of Peru. It's part of the Atacama Desert, so it's really dry, except when we have El Niño events. Then we have floodings and a lot of rain. This picture shows you part of the fleet. So these are some of the shrimp trawling vessels. And to give you a better idea of what we're dealing with, this is a picture of one of the vessels. They're usually 8 meters or so long. They use 120 horsepower engines. And what you see here is basically the mast. From the mast, we have 2 outriggers, one of each side of the vessel, with one of those doors hanging out of the vessel. And this basically helps the mouth of the net to keep open while they're trawling. So the area of study is a very interesting area because it basically occurs in an area that has been identified as a hotspot for biodiversity, for marine biodiversity. And it basically is in the area where 2 currents merge. This is the Humboldt current coming from the south, and this is one of the major upwelling systems in the world. So it's cold waters and nutrient-rich waters. And we also get the equatorial current from the north, and this one has less nutrients and is characterized by warm waters. So the area where they merge is the study area, and these different characteristics or environmental characteristics of the currents actually result in a lot of species richness in the area, because we have species from both ecosystems overlying there. On the right-hand side, you can see a picture of the bycatch in the shrimp trawling fishery in Peru. Before this project, there weren't that many studies on bycatch, and there were almost none in the area. But from some preliminary studies, we knew that bycatch is very high for these fisheries in the area, and about 85 to maybe 95% of the bycatch, of the weight, is bycatch for this fishery. And something important to mention is that the fishery is actually an illegal fishery, so no trawling is allowed within the 5 nautical miles from the shore. But actually most, if not, well, all vessels operate within this area. And this, well, there's several government interventions, and we have the Navy sometimes stopping a vessel and taking their gear and their catch away. So they confiscate their nets, but this results in fishers protesting and usually blocking the main highway in Peru that communicates the capital city with northern cities. So this impacts the distributions of services and goods in Peru. And this is just some newspaper articles talking about this problem with the fishers. The fact that the fishery is illegal has also repercussions on the price of the shrimp. So there's a black market to buy shrimp, and basically the buyer dominates the prices heavily. So fishers are paid very low for their shrimp, but also it results in a decreased quality of life of fishers, because they're basically hiding and they can't really use ports to land their catch. So it's all done, you know, at the back or in not that close to port, because it's a black market. So it results in quite a few issues for their livelihoods as well. So this slide here shows government, like official figures of the production of shrimp in Peru. So in the blue line, you can see the total production. We're talking about in the last few years between 30 and 50,000 tons of shrimp produced. The red line is what comes from aquaculture, and the north of Peru has a lot of shrimp aquaculture. But what was missing, or what we don't know, and we're inferring from this graph, is basically the green line. Is this fishing? If this is fishing, then we're talking about 10 to 20,000 tons in the last few years that has come from an illegal fishery, which is quite a bit of product really that we're talking about. So because of all these issues and the fishery being illegal, and what happened here is the fishers approached the Agrarian National University to try to open discussions with government about maybe changing their illegal status to a legal one if they would have put in place some fisheries management measures. The fishers are aware of the problem that they have, that they pose on the ecosystem on because bycatch is very high, and they recognize that. And they wanted to ask scientists for solutions of how to improve this, so how to diminish their impact. And this is how the Dinámico Peru project really starts. And this is a collaboration between the University of St. Andrews, the Agrarian University, and regional government, and REDES, NGO, and the FAO, with funding from the British side, from the British Council and the Newton Fund. So the main 4 objectives of this project were to first assess bycatch and identify times and areas of higher bycatch risk. The second objective was to compare bycatch and design alternative nets, and then compare their bycatch with the traditional net. The third objective was to conduct an economic analysis. How important is the fleet, and what would it mean if we would change the current net to the alternative nets design in terms of cost of the nets and also of their catch? What would that mean to their income? And the last objective was to develop guidelines for a management plan of the fishery. So the first objective, to identify times and areas of higher bycatch, was done via a 2-tiered approach. So one way was we recruited fishers to use an app developed by the library service here at St. Andrews. And we recruited 20 fishers, and this app, basically, if you look at the left hand side figure, we tried to do it as simple as possible. So on the top you see a button which they had to scroll, and that would start recording positions. So you can see on the middle and on the right hand side how each positional point is being recorded as they're going fishing. But on the top you can see that Cala 1, Cala 2, Cala 3, that's basically hole 1, hole 2, hole 3. And what they had to do there is to record an estimate of their net, of the total weight in the net, basically, of the total catch. So we had on board observers talking to them and also checking how good they were in estimating the total weight of the catch. And they were not bad at that, so that was good. So we had an approximate estimate of the total weight of the catch, and they also had to, at the end of the trip, provide information on how many kilos of the main target species they were landing. So because we had the kilos of target species, the kilos of total catch, we could estimate with their information the proportion of bycatch in their fishing trip. The other approach to identify times and areas of higher bycatch risk was by using observers, and they conducted a more thorough analysis of what was what was coming up with the net, and they basically recorded the total capture, they weighted the capture, and then they had the weight of the total commercial species catch, so including the main target species of shrimp, which is called the coffee shrimp, but also other species that are important, such as carajito and flatfish. And then they also took a sample, and they took a 20-liter bucket where they just put some of the catch inside, and they recorded all the species composition to the level of species where possible to understand what was the bycatch composition. So the second objective was to design and build alternative nets. And on the top hand video, you can see how this process took place over several days. But on the left lower video, these are two experts that came from Mexico, and they helped us design and build the nets together with fishers. And I'm just gonna run this one. So if you want more details about the actual construction of the net, just email us. But basically for this talk, I'm just gonna say that we had what we call a small window net. So this is basically an escape panel, fish escape panel in the codent, and we also trialed a big window net. And these nets were designed taking into account the main species of fish caught in the area. So the expert designed these nets knowing a bit about the biology and ecology of the fish that the observers were recording during their trips. So the economic analysis, for the economic analysis, we conducted 30 face-to-face interviews with fishers in 4 out of 8 ports of landing. You can see the figure there on the right-hand side. I have to say, I mean, we say port of landing, but really the buyer would take a small boat and pick up the catch from most of the vessels, because the other fishers won't allow them to land their catch in port because they don't want trawling occurring in the waters. We also had validation. We did some workshops where we showed the fishers the result of the interviews, and well, not only the fishers, NGOs and government, and looked at if these figures or the figures were reasonable. We conducted drone surveys in selected ports to calculate the number of vessels in the fleet, because we didn't even know how many vessels there were in the fleet. There was some information or some estimates of around 200 vessels, but we weren't really sure because they are illegal. They are not, there's no government record on these vessels. We calculated estimates for trip income from the interviews, but also independently from the data collected by the observers. And with this, we estimated catch volumes, values, gross and net income of the fishers, and the number of people directly employed by the fishery. And last but not least, in order to develop guidelines for the management plan, we conducted several workshops with stakeholders, and where there were monthly meetings with fishers throughout the project. This was a 12-month-long project. And at the end, we had discussions. We showed the results of the project, and we had discussions with the fishers, with NGOs, and with government representatives to try to develop some guidelines for a potential management plan in this fishery. So just to have the terminology right, this is just a nice diagram to show what we mean by catch, bycatch, and discard. So we have the total catch, that is basically everything that comes out in the net, and this is divided into target species and bycatch. The target species in this case was the coffee shrimp, Farfantepaneus californiensis, and the bycatch. And then bycatch is then divided into retained species. So there's some species that are probably not your target species, but you will still retain them. So commercial species of fish, for example. And then there's everything that you will throw overboard, basically, and these are your discards or stuff that will not get used. Just a quick slide to show you how many species we found. 308 species during this year, the annual project, and this varied from 5 to 55 species per hole. And just to show you how, in this graph, how the composition, the groups changed per month, but in general, we had around 100 species recorded each month, with fish and invertebrate species being the most common in the catch. And the shrimp in the blue box is the coffee shrimp, that's the target species, but actually we recorded about 12 species of shrimp as well. So here I'm just showing you a few figures so that you can see what we're dealing with. But I thought it would be nice also to include some of the fish and invertebrates we got, and just to tell you that some of the fish are actually commercially targeted by other fisheries. That's why there's some conflicts there. But there's also some species that might be more vulnerable or protected that are occurring in the bycatch. And just to show you a few nice pictures of very pretty fish and invertebrates. So you can see we even had a few lobsters and a few octopus in the catch. All right, so in regards to objective 1, to identify times and areas of higher bycatch risk, this is an example of one of the fishing trips submitted by a fisher. In total, we had 410 fishing trips submitted by fishers. They're starting using the app in September 2019 until March 2020, before COVID. And this is just an example. So in figure A, you can see the trip where the points are closer together is where they're trawling. But we also had information from the observers for a subset of trips where we knew exactly when they were hauling. So we used this information to train random forest models, and we got an 87% accuracy in predicting what the behavior of each positional data was. In this case, is it either trawling or non-trawling? So in figure B, you can see in yellow when the fishers have trawled. So we applied these models to all the data submitted by the app from the fishers. But we also had data from the observers. And here you can see they conducted 113 fishing trips, sampling 496 holes during the year. They did sample from April 2019 to March 2020, again, before COVID. And the left-hand side figures just to show you how fine scale spatial resolution we can get. So these are the points when these points depict trawling activities. The blue line on the top corner is 1 kilometer. It's a scale of 1 kilometer, so you can see the level of spatial resolution that we have. And putting together the information from the fishers and from the observers, we found 3 main areas that where the fishery conducted their activities, with the caveat that this is information from fishers that participated in the study. So we had more information in the north. This is for several reasons. One, the fishers in the north were more prone to participating to this, but also a lot of fishers from this southern bay, Sechura Bay, migrate to the north throughout the year when catches are better in the north. So the fishery was conducted throughout all the months in the north. So this area in the north was better for us to monitor changes in space and time. So all the next slides I'm going to discuss from now on are based on this northern area, basically. So first of all, just to show you the shrimp catch, what it looks like. This is a frequency distribution of shrimp catch per hole. So you can see that it varies between 0 and 50 kilos. Usually there's some big catches there, but very few, above 100. And what we try to do is to model a shrimp catch and understand which factors were affecting the catch in this northern area that I talked to you about. So on the left bottom side figure, you can see that shrimp catch was affected by moon phase. And basically 0 means a new moon and 3 means full moon. So you get a couple of kilos difference. So usually you catch a bit more shrimp during new moon. And then on the right-hand side, these are the model estimates of predicted catch in kilos. And what the main take-home message here is we have variations in catch over space depending on the season. And in spring and summer, there is usually more predicted shrimp catch, and also the extension of the area that has higher values of shrimp is higher during these seasons, while in autumn and winter you get some areas with very low shrimp catch. The part that we were mostly interested in was to understand what the shrimp to bycatch ratio was. So basically, if you look at this is the frequency distribution of the shrimp to bycatch ratio, and a shrimp to bycatch ratio of 1 means that you're catching the same amount of shrimp than you are catching bycatch in terms of weight. So 10 kilo shrimp to 10 kilo bycatch would be one ratio, a ratio of 1. Anything below 1 means you are getting way more bycatch than catching shrimp, and anything above it, which we got, is you're catching more shrimp than any other bycatch. So this is just to help you understand this ratio. The models we used explained 47% of the variability in this ratio, and we found that the shrimp and bycatch, this ratio was affected by time of the day. So on the left hand bottom figure, you can see the time of the day where 0 is midnight, and positive values are minutes after midnight and negative values minutes before midnight. And what this is telling you is that at dawn, there was usually higher shrimp catches when compared to the bycatch. And if you look at the plot on the right-hand side, this is the predicted ratio. As I said, higher ratios are better in our case. So if you see green and blue values, that means that there's higher shrimp catch compared to the bycatch. So again, what you can see is that there's better shrimp to bycatch ratios in spring and summer in general for the area. And usually, actually, the shrimp to bycatch ratio is better when you are closer to shore than further away. And again, you get worse, let's say, higher impact in autumn and winter in this fishery. So this sort of analysis can help us already start to think about potential spatial and temporal management measures that we could apply and discuss with fishers to try to improve the sustainability of the fishery. Yeah, this was just for a year. So of course we would have to monitor again or in the subsequent years, but already this gives us an indication of what might be happening with shrimp and their associated bycatch. And something that we were interested about also is to see if we could use the information sent by the fishers on bycatch, because it sounds a bit counterintuitive to trust fishers to submit information on bycatch, especially in an illegal fishery where bycatch is a main issue of concern. So we look at what the observers recorded over time in terms of the percentage of bycatch, and we wanted to compare that with what the fishers reported over time. So as I said, fishers reported from September to March, but in general, the magnitude of the percentage of bycatch is very similar between what was recorded by observers and by fishers using the app. And usually you get the same levels of magnitude. And even if you look at November, you get that drop in bycatch compared to the previous month and to December. Something I'm not sure about is what happened in February. Maybe the fishers that used the app went to a completely different area than the ones that the areas where the observers were, but we don't know. But in general, this shows that fishers could be trusted to collect their own fishing bycatch data to look at temporal trends in bycatch in this illegal fishery. The second objective was to compare bycatch with alternative nets. And remember, I showed you the two different nets of using a small window and a large window. And this is basically per hole, showing in red the conventional net and in blue the modified or the new net, and looking at the capture per unit effort of bycatch. So basically you see in almost all of the holes that were compared between the two different nets, you get a reduction in bycatch for the two different nets. So that's great news, but you also have to assess what happens to the different components of bycatch. So what you want is to be catching the same amount of shrimp and decrease bycatch of other species. So we look at the differences in catch per unit effort for each of the components. So if you look at figure A, you see that for the small window, actually on average, the shrimp capture increased, and with the large window, you got very similar captures of shrimp for the modified net. So that's great news. And in terms of fish, we saw a reduction in the capture per unit effort of bycatch of fish for both nets, around 25 to 30% reduction bycatch. So the same for invertebrates, we have a reduction of 10 and 20% bycatch, and macroalgae as well decreased massively so with the new nets. So overall, these nets were great in reducing bycatch compared to the net that they were using now. And now I'll hand it over to Mark, who will talk about the economic analysis in the project.
Okay. I just need to share my screen. Everybody now can see this screen. Part of my role in this project was to try to understand some of the economic and social impacts of a fishery that we had no information on at all. As Tania's explained, it's an illegal, unregulated, unreported fishery. So a lot of the statistics that we would normally rely on in order to be able to quantify and characterize a fishery are simply not there. So the first thing that we did was to organize some face-to-face interviews with fishers, and that was helped by the fact that we had some fabulous students that acted as observers for us, and they've been working with the fishermen for the best part of a year before we undertook these face-to-face surveys. So there was a great deal of trust that had already been built up between the students, between the observers and the fishermen. So they were happy to share information with us. They took some time to design, and we designed a survey that would hopefully ask the right questions in the right way, because obviously language barriers and obviously interpretations of what we mean in survey questions can vary quite a lot depending upon the way they're asked. So we spent quite a lot of time refining the interview process. The interviews were conducted at 4 of the 8, in inverted commas, ports where we know that shrimp are landed. Obviously, the interviews were self-selected. Of the people that we interviewed, 67% were owners, 33% were captains but not owners of vessels. The main ports of landing were Mancora, Cabo Verde, Talara, and Constante. There are lots of caveats attached to this approach in the sense that some of the fishermen interpreted questions in different ways despite our preparation. There were large variations in response, some of which may actually be real, and we had to verify that. And some of the questions were interpreted in different ways by different fishermen. The data sources effectively in isolation were obviously the survey of fishers. We had catches from the observer trips. We were able to define values as best we could from official sources, so per kilogram values from statistics from the organization in Peru responsible for collecting those, and that's called IMAPE. And then in order to verify some of the numbers of vessels, we conducted a drone survey at some of the ports as well. Lots of stuff on this slide. The bits to focus on are the ones in red. So in terms of fleet structure, what they told us was the fishermen said that they thought there were about 105 vessels in total. Now that was obviously in complete contrast to perceived wisdom, which was that there were possibly in excess of 200 vessels. So we didn't actually believe that number, and we began to panic slightly thinking, oh, has the survey worked? I'll come back to that in a minute. We then also looked at the number of people that work on each vessel, and essentially when we calculate what we think is the number of vessels and the estimated number of people working on those vessels, we get a direct employment of somewhere in the region of 315 people. We also did a lot of other analysis around capacity and tonnage, length of vessel and capacity. And for example, as Tania has already mentioned, most of the vessels are around about 8 to 9 meters in length, around 7-8 tons in weight, with an engine capacity of 110, 120 horsepower. In order to be able to verify what the fishermen were telling us about numbers, we decided that we had to try and connect some sort of independent survey. So there were two ways we did that. One of which was we actually took a small vessel out and counted some vessels in one of the port areas. And in a number of others, we conducted a drone survey, which we can just show you here. And it became possible from the drone survey to very accurately side, the vessels that are clearly dredge vessels, or sorry, trawl vessels, are set out there. And the way we can pick them out is that they have very characteristic deck layout. Often it's possible to use doors. You obviously have the outriggers strung on them as well. So we could pick out those vessels very easily. So this takes us on to then what's a vessel cost? And this is where we got quite a lot of interpretation and misinterpretation about what their vessel cost, because effectively they would give us what it cost when they bought it, which may have been 25 years ago. Some of them would interpret it as what it would have cost them to have bought their vessel now in the state that it's in. So we ended up with a whole range of different values. And that sort of bottomed out at around £9,000 per vessel, once we took all that variation into consideration. And we also verified those figures subsequently in discussions with NGOs, with fishers, and with government as well. And they came to a reasonable consensus that 9K per vessel is about right. If we talk about the gear on board that vessel, so that's what they need to physically fish, so the doors, the ropes, the nets, that comes in at about £750 UK money. And these are all the exchange rates that I calculated as of yesterday. So it's about 4.4 Peruvian sols to a pound. Small graph on the bottom left-hand side describes the distribution of vessel age, and that's quite interesting because most of the vessels are certainly under 20 years old. Quite a large proportion of the fleet is about 15 years old, actually in a pretty poor state of repair. And as a rough judgment, you would be talking about vessels that are, in many cases, pretty unseaworthy at that sort of age and with the sort of levels of maintenance that are going on. If we look at estimated per fishing day maintenance costs, now, this seems complicated, but again, just focus on those red banded areas. So if you imagine that we're considering moving into a situation where a fishery might be better regulated, that might mean, for example, that they need to have equipment that is standardized. Now, equipment they make themselves, so hence it isn't standard. And so there are things like buoys, for example, where there is no data in terms of the cost of the buoys and the way that they would deal with that, because they simply use recycled material, plastic bottles, things like that. But in order, if we were to move to a more standard net with a given level of trawl efficiency, we might have to standardize those things. So there might inherently be a cost in that in the future, but nothing at the moment. Another really important area is around documentation and taxes. Clearly, they don't pay any taxes. Documentation, so there's nothing around licensing and quotas. There are no payments for the use of the resource that we can identify. But you'll notice that there's a little black flag underneath that. And that's because there are all sorts of hidden taxes, unofficial taxes, bribes, for example. And also one of the things that we didn't take into consideration when we started the project was piracy. There are other fishermen that will effectively go and take the fish from the illegal fishermen. And there are also criminal gangs that will arrive late at night and they will board the vessel and that they will take the catch under threat of damage to people and vessel. And as a result, there is a hidden tax there that we really don't know the value of, but certainly I can attest to the fact that we were on a vessel. We thought that we were being boarded by pirates. We had to hide all of our equipment. A small proportion of the catch was left in view, so that would be effectively the sacrificial catch that would be taken by the pirates. An argument ensued between the person that came on board and the person that was the skipper, and it turned out that this wasn't a pirate, this was actually a local official, a local ranger. We were fishing in what was clearly a protected area, and we shouldn't have been there. But after a small exchange of shrimps, the ranger left and we carried on fishing. So hidden taxes. What we're talking about then as a daily rate in terms of maintenance cost works out about £17. Estimated fishing per day costs about £72 per day. So that's the cost of fuel, food, ice, drinkable water and other costs, about £72 a day. Just go back to that. Also, we needed to get some consensus around the number, or the reasonable number of fishing days per year. And the general consensus we came to after much discussion was that about 260 days a year would be a reasonable estimate for the number of days that the people would fish here. What's important to recognise is that when catch is sold, then a proportion of that sale is divided up amongst the crew, and there's generally a shares ratio. And the best definition of a shares ratio that we could get from our survey was that the captain would get about 18%, the crew, of which there would generally be two or up to two, would get about 14% each, and then the owner, if it wasn't the captain, would get about 54%. If they were both the owner and the captain, obviously this is looking pretty lucrative for them. When we look at gross catches and derived income, the bottom line is that what we can find, if we'll go back to what we call in-kind in a moment, but essentially what we're talking about is a fishery that in gross value is worth about £7.9 million, which is in Peruvian terms quite a lot of money. So what you notice here is that the way we calculated that was to take the catch statistics that we got from our observers and the amount of fish and shellfish that we know are being brought on board. We then used the values, the maximum values and the minimum values for price from that information to generate those gross value figures that you see on this particular slide. When we talk about catch prices and volumes per year, please look at the lower boxes first. Again, using that difference between maximum catches, minimum catches, maximum value, what we ended up with was a midpoint value for shrimps somewhere in the region of about 2.6 thousand tonnes per year as the tonnage coming from this particular sector from an individual vessel, and for the whole fleet somewhere in the region of 12.8 thousand tonnes per year. Self-consumption is what happens when a proportion of the catch is given to the crew, and that's essentially as part payment to the crew. And that equates totally across the fleet to an estimated 3% of total tonnage, which is about 3,600 tonnes. Sorry, 360 tonnes. If we then break that down into net profit, so we've taken out all the costs, again, bottom line value here is, and this is the important one, the vessel owner, the person that gets most of the value out of this, less any taxes, which we know they don't pay, or with any taxes that they do pay that we're not aware of, we're talking about somewhere in the region of £49,000 income per year at a maximum, or £12,000 at a minimum. And again, if we talk about a midpoint value for the entire estimated sectoral net profit, that would be about 3.2 million as a net profit for the sector. Moving on to what does somebody earn per day, and this will be quite important when we get to the end of this session, because effectively what this slide tells us is that the fishermen told us, so the table above is what the fishermen told us, what they earn, what a captain earned, what a deckhand earned per day, and what a vessel owner might earn per day. And then what we actually calculated based on catch values. And you'll notice that they're actually pretty similar. If we took the midpoint value of the calculated or estimated catch value, it's very similar to what we're coming out with the averages for those that were presented to us by the fishing survey, which again gives us some confidence that what we've been told by the fishermen is pretty well correct. We then have to talk about economic multipliers. What that means is that when something is sold at first sale value, it then enters a supply chain, and various things happen to those goods and the services associated with those goods which add value. And there are various multipliers that economists use in order to be able to describe that. And we found in the literature values ranging from 2.7 to 4.6. We found one authoritative report which came out a value of 2.9 for the whole of the seafood sector in Peru, and that's the one that we've used. So in taking our initial value and then multiplying that up using the official multiplier that we found here, that equates to effectively a midpoint value for the whole value of this particular fishery of about £21 million a year. And let's not forget that's being generated by something like 100 vessels or just over 100 vessels. The question is, by introducing our new technology, introducing our new ideas, is it going to cost more? Is it going to put the fishermen off? So simply by calculating the cost of a net, for example, we can see that the new net that we used is actually slightly less in cost than the traditional net, so no problem there. If we looked at the cost of operation, we haven't had a chance to do that, but we would need to look at things like drag, fuel costs, also the durability of the net, how often it's going to be replaced and repaired. We have no information on that at the moment, but at least in ballpark area, we know that the costs, as we currently know them, are probably about the same or possibly slightly less. The acid question: in using the new nets, are we losing revenue? Are the fishermen going to be effectively made poorer by using the new net and therefore not use it? The information you see on this slide was generated from the small panel nets. We haven't actually calculated the information or the data from the large panel nets at the moment, but these are from the small panel nets. And what you can see from the main commercial species, so we've got the shrimps, the flounders or the flatfish, and the carajito, which is the Peruvian hake, that there is essentially no significant difference between the amount caught with the traditional net and the amount caught with the new net. So the new net is actually very effective at reducing bycatch, but not reducing the amount of commercial species that we're actually able to see in that. That becomes particularly important because on the images that Tania showed you, one of the main fishing areas, which is Talara, which is in the south, actually relies more heavily on that bycatch of fish than it does on the shrimp. So even though it's designated as part of the shrimp trawl fishery, in fact, much of its catch, particularly at certain times of the year, is actually constituted by what we're calling bycatch, which are those commercial fish species. So the big picture: imagine Peru as a whole. We looked at the housing census from 2017, which is the most recent, and what they described as not poor are those people who are earning less than £76 per month. The extreme poverty level comes in at around £42 per month, and the minimum living wage in Peru is described as about £211 per month at current exchange rates. So that's pretty stark truth about what people actually earn. In 2017, about 21%, 22% of the people in Peru were in one of those described categories of poverty. 10 years before that, almost 42% of the population were in that described classification of poverty. And there is also a split between urban and rural areas, particularly the main urban areas will be about 15% and 44% in extreme poverty in rural areas. But that needs to be qualified by the fact that most of that poverty occurs in the Andes, in the mountainous areas where there is extreme poverty. So if we then revert to the numbers that we've learned from this sort of very broad estimate of revenues, income, gross income, net income, captains and deckhands are effectively earning 3 times the living wage that you would normally expect from those statistics. That's 50% higher than the average monthly wage for a man in Lima. So what this tells us is that although this is an illegal, unreported, unregulated fishery, there is a very lucrative reason for those involved in it to continue to prosecute that fishery, and particularly as it employs quite a high proportion of semi-skilled labour. We know from other studies that literacy rates, particularly in the fishing sector, are quite low. So this represents a very lucrative opportunity for those involved in prosecuting that fishery. If we then look at all those things that we've talked about, the cost of vessels, the operational costs, and the sorts of income that owners might expect to get from this process, again, the story it tells us is that the owners stand to do very well out of it. They're going to be earning vastly more than they would be doing, if you like, a normal, in inverted commas, job. And in terms of the government, we're looking at a gross added value with multipliers of somewhere in the region of £21 million a year from less or around 100 vessels. So again, this all adds up to a significant incentive for the government and the regulators to effectively remain quite equivocal on whether they either stop or regulate the fishery. As part of the next part of this process, we engaged with lots of different stakeholders, meetings with regulators, meetings with NGOs, sometimes separately, sometimes together, and a whole array of different suggestions evolved from that. And there was some consensus around legal aspects, technological aspects, fisheries aspects, economic and management aspects, and I've essentially summarized those very crudely in what you see here on this slide, and you can interrogate this afterwards if you want to. But we did reach some consensus about a way forward that people would potentially agree upon. But there remains a huge conundrum because it is an extremely volatile situation. The NGOs continue to strongly oppose the trawl fishery within 5 nautical miles. They really just don't want to know. The government is unable or unwilling to police or stop trawling, but the government is also cautious about engaging with research and any dialogue, which in some respects would be seen to be legitimizing that fishery. So there's a sort of a covert need for this discussion to go on behind closed doors so that we can achieve some agreement. And then also fishers have a strong financial incentive to continue to trawl illegally, even though they're doing it at high risk, with the risk of piracy, with the risk of losing their boats, and on dangerous vessels, they will continue to do it. And the government itself obviously has a strong implicit, if not explicit, economic reason for continuing, because they are pressing very hard for development and trying to raise living standards. So really just a name check here at the end to thank all of those people that are involved, a large number of people involved in this project, particularly in Peru. And I'd like to really highlight the students that you see there in the top right-hand slide, because they worked incredibly hard for a year, often in incredibly difficult and quite unpleasant circumstances. And they did an absolutely amazing job of gathering this data. And many of them have used the data in their projects for their, what effectively is the equivalent of our MSc qualification. I'll stop there and we can now answer questions.
Okay, thank you, Mark, and thank you, Tania, for that joint presentation. We've had a couple of questions already submitted through the Q&A box, so to any of our attendees that are still with us, if you have a question that you would like to ask, please pop it in the Q&A box, or alternatively, you can raise your hand and I can unmute you and you can ask via audio. If you're watching this on YouTube, please just pop it in the comments box and I will see that your question has been asked through there. The first question that came through the Q&A box was actually from Sophie Smout, who is one of the named people involved in this project, and she's kind of reflecting on one of the graphs that Tania showed, saying maybe January shows more inconsistency between fishers and observers. So Tania, would you like to kind of expand on that?
Yeah, I saw that one from Sophie. Yeah, Sophie, you're right. I should have circled the January one instead of the February one. But it was basically just 1 month that showed a bit of inconsistency out of 8 months. So yeah.
Okay.
And that answers your question, yeah.
And the next question comes from Stefan, asking, is it a beam trawl or an otter trawl net fishery that you are investigating?
Well, that would be called, well, it uses the doors to leave the mouth of the net open, so an otter trawl, I guess.
Yeah, it's not a beam trawl.
Okay, thank you. The next question asks about the two types of nets that you were investigating, and the question asks, the shrimp catch using the small window trawl net was higher than the conventional gear and the large window trawl net. Is this because there is a higher number of smaller individuals caught, i.e. smaller individuals mean smaller individuals below size at maturity? What implication would this have for harvesting at maximum sustainable yield?
Yeah, you're right. There was a very high number of small individuals. And there's still a lot of study we need to conduct in terms of even on size of maturity for reproduction, because we don't know almost anything about the biology and ecology of the shrimp. And well, basically that was one of the discussion points at the end of the project as well, that we need to start collecting more. Well, as part of the project, actually, one of the theses is looking at the size composition and look at low data, or having using low data required inputs for stock assessment of shrimp. So keep in touch and send us an email, because this is part of one of the students' thesis, is to look at how to assess the stock status with very, very few data, basically, that we have for the fishery.
Okay, thank you. Next question also comes from Sophie, asking, is the shrimp fishery sustainable in terms of stock / long term?
Yeah, this is something that we are not sure. At the moment, we don't have information to be able to answer that, but we are trying to get more information on this. In general, it's a very fast-growing species, is what we know. So presumably it can withstand the impact of fishing so far. But the issue with the fisheries also, it's targeting other species that juveniles of other species of fish, and we don't have information on what the impact of that is on those stocks either. So there's a lot more work to be done in this area, really starting from a lot of research on the biology and ecology, the fishing effort, catch. There's so many unknowns, and we're just starting to understand a bit more what this fishery actually means for the stock and for other commercial species that are of concern.
Okay, thank you. We haven't got any other questions coming in at the minute, so if anyone has any burning questions, please type them in the Q&A box or do the raise the hand feature. I guess I would like to ask kind of what is the next steps for this project? Are we going to be able to see some of these results in papers, reports? Where can we find out a bit more about this outside of the presentation?
Well, there's currently a report. Well, a report has been written and it's been published on the project, and we're gonna distribute physical copies to fishers, NGOs, and university. So we have, I think, 500 copies ready for distribution, COVID dependent again. And we're working on some papers at the moment to try to give this information or send this information away. Something that we didn't mention in this talk, but that was of great interest to NGOs working or that knew about this project, was we also tried a different fishing net, and this is called suripera, and basically it doesn't really have contact with the bottom, and is operated manually by fishers. And we still need to learn how to use it because it takes a lot of training with fishers, but we had some positive results in the north of the study area. So that could be another potential future project. Maybe change the fishery gear to something that is not trawling, but that's further down the line. There were so many political issues with this project. It was very hard for everyone involved to keep working on this and feel like we're doing a good contribution, because you can either turn a blind eye and just say, oh look, the fishery is illegal, it shouldn't be there, but it's gonna be there. As Mark said, it's profitable, it's gonna happen. So you can either turn a blind eye and say we're not gonna do it, we're just gonna leave it there, and then you still get all this high bycatch, or you can try to reduce bycatch in some ways. So this is the approach that we as scientists are taking. How do we reduce bycatch? And yeah, I think the results of the project were quite positive in those terms. We have some ideas now how to reduce bycatch in the fishery, but now we need more discussions with government and with other stakeholders to see how we get around the fact that it is an illegal fishery so far. Yeah.
Okay, that's good to hear, and thank you for expanding on that other bit, the other nets that you got to trial as well. That was really good to hear. We haven't got any other questions to run through, and that leaves us to end perfectly on time. So that leaves me to say thank you, Tania, and thank you, Mark. For anyone who's still with us, if you want to get in contact with either of our speakers, their contact details are on the screen right now. So please feel free to drop them an email. But thank you very much, both of you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much for having us.